Today, Kamala Harris urges her supporters to maintain hope while conceding defeat in the US election.
While I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese speaks with Donald Trump, congratulating him on his election victory.
President Trump has run a campaign based on change, and he's made it clear he's going to do things differently. So we shouldn't be surprised as things change.
Also ahead, the government moves to ban children under 16 from using social media. And Chemist Warehouse allowed to merge with Sigma, creating an $8.8 billion pharmaceutical giant. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Gemma Veness. The United States has swung to the right. Kamala Harris has conceded defeat to Donald Trump in the presidential election. It was an emphatic victory for the man who lost the presidency 4 years ago. Not only flipping the blue wall states of Wisconsin, Michigan and Pennsylvania, the president-elect is also well placed to win the popular vote. The first time a Republican has done so since 2004. North America correspondent Carrington Clark is in Philadelphia and joins us. Carrington, what has the president-elect been doing today?
Well, given that Donald Trump now is, for the second time, the president-elect, a lot of people want his ear. He spent much of today fielding calls from both supporters and world leaders who were congratulating him on what has turned out to be an emphatic victory. But he also took two calls from people who are certainly not supporters. That is the woman he defeated at the election, Vice President Kamala Harris, who did concede the election to him, but also the current president, Joe Biden, the man who defeated him back in 2020, who extended an invitation to Donald Trump to come to the White House so that they can help facilitate the smooth transfer of power. Now, this stands in stark contrast to what happened after the 2020 election. Donald Trump has never conceded that loss, and nor did he invite Joe Biden to come to the White House. And he also seemed to put blocks in place to stop Joe Biden, as the then president-elect, receiving the information, the access that he needed to facilitate that smooth transfer of power. And then he pointedly did not turn up at the inauguration of Joe Biden.
And what does a second Donald Trump term look like?
Well, Donald Trump ran on two major policy issues. One was the state of the economy and immigration. On the economy, he is promising large tax cuts, but he's also promising to slap tariffs on other countries, both friends and foes. Now, we will see how he goes about doing that and how quickly he enacts those rules, or whether enacts those tariffs, or whether or not this is a negotiating tactic. One of the major questions at this point is what type of Congress the president will face. At the moment, the Senate has gone to the Republicans. The House of Representatives remains in question. If the Republicans are able to take that House, it would be a repeat of what happened in 2016 when the Republicans had control of the presidency, the Senate and the House of Representatives. If that is the case, it will allow him a much freer hand. If the Democrats are able to take control of the House, that would put a block to some of the policy issues. But what will also be closely watched is who he puts into his cabinet and to his administration, with suggestions Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, and RFK Jr., a known vaccine skeptic, might have senior roles within the White House.
Carrington Clark in Philadelphia, thank you. North America correspondent Barbara Miller has been following the Harris campaign. She has the latest from Howard University in Washington, where Kamala Harris gave her concession speech.
Kamala Harris did what she had to do here, and that was to publicly concede that she had lost the election. She said that she had phoned Donald Trump, the president-elect, to concede she'd lost and to congratulate him. But this was a fighting speech. She said, while I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign. The fight for freedom, for opportunity, for fairness and dignity of all people. And she essentially ran through some of the main issues of her campaign, the fight for reproductive freedoms, to try and reduce the scourge of gun violence, for example. She also then turned it into a little bit of a pep talk, speaking directly to young people, saying, you know, it's going to be okay, don't despair. Sometimes it takes a while to win the fight, but that doesn't mean that we won't win it, and we have the power.
Don't you ever listen when anyone tells you something is impossible because it has never been done before. You have the capacity to do extraordinary good in the world. And so to everyone who is watching, do not despair. This is not a time to throw up our hands. This is a time to roll up our sleeves.
It was a brief speech, and it certainly very, very much moved the people who came here to hear it today.
Beautiful speech, you know, very disappointed in the outcome, but she gave her all, and that's all we can ask for.
Very gracious, uplifting, the right sentiment for the moment.
Young girls and women my age and younger especially are so let down because, yet again, we don't have an example that we're able to overcome.
Now, Kamala Harris has promised a peaceful transfer of power. Of course, she is part of the Biden administration and now has to go back to work essentially as vice president in American elections. The transfer of power doesn't happen until January, so she will work with Joe Biden. And we've also heard from Joe Biden today. He's also called Donald Trump and said he'll do everything he can to ensure that power is handed over peacefully. But with that, the Harris-Walz campaign, a very brief campaign in American election terms, just over 100 days, is over. And once again, with it, the promise or the hope that this country might elect a female as its president.
Well, our US elections analyst Casey Briggs joins us now. Casey, can you run us through what ended up happening with the Electoral College vote?
Yeah, afternoon, Gemma. These are the figures at the moment with two states still in doubt. Donald Trump has 295 Electoral College votes. Kamala Harris just 226. Let's talk about the states that have flipped. The state of Georgia, which Joe Biden won on a very narrow margin 4 years ago, has gone red. And these three states, now, they used to often be referred to as the blue wall. They were reliably voting for Democrats. They were a firewall that helped support Democratic candidates for president. Donald Trump has won them in this election, all three of them. He knocked down the blue wall in 2016. Joe Biden managed to rebuild it in 2020, and he's run a bulldozer through those three states once again, and we're seeing swings toward the Republicans. And there are, as we're saying, two states still in doubt. One of them is Arizona, where Donald Trump leads. The other one is Nevada, where Donald Trump also leads by about 5 percentage points, and Kamala Harris is in a bit of trouble there as well, because the results in Nevada often are really driven by what happens in Clark County, the single biggest county. Kamala Harris is winning there by about a percentage point, but the problem for her is that Joe Biden won that by 9 points, more than 9 points. This is a county Democrats have to run up the score in, run up the margin in quite significantly to offset the losses elsewhere. So there's a battle ahead for Kamala Harris if she wants to have any hope of claiming either of these states. At the moment, they are both trending Donald Trump's way, and that means Donald Trump has a viable path toward 312 Electoral College votes. We've seen swings in those battleground states. We've seen swings everywhere, Gemma, and some of the biggest swings are in some of the safer states. We are watching an election where young people have swung toward the Republicans, communities of colour, black people, black men in particular, and Hispanic communities are swinging toward the Republicans. And it raises some really deep questions for the Democratic Party, who has relied on some of those coalitions to get them into power over a very long period of time. And it shows some great opportunities for the Republican Party and for Donald Trump, who has managed to make significant inroads in those communities, because some of the swings we're seeing in some of, blue states like New York, Kamala Harris is winning by nearly 12 points. She will win that state, there's no question there, but Joe Biden won it by more than 20 points. We're seeing big swings in big states that are painting a picture here of alignment in politics, a realignment of coalitions and groups that the Democrats used to be able to rely on. Well, not quite so much anymore.
Casey, where is the popular vote at the moment?
Yeah, because of states like California and New York and Florida swinging toward Donald Trump as well, this is where the popular vote is at the moment. It is not final. It's going to take a bit of time, days or longer, for us to know the final results here. But Donald Trump has 5 million more votes nationally at the moment than Donald Trump. That is 3.4% or so ahead. And that gap, it may well close a bit as states like California continue to count. But Donald Trump is very well placed at this point to win the national popular vote. If he does so, which we think he's well placed to do, if he does that, he'll be the first Republican since 2004, in 2 decades, to win a national popular vote at a presidential election. George W. Bush was the last one to do it in 2004. The first time he won office, he didn't win the national popular vote. And of course, when Donald Trump won in 2016, Hillary Clinton beat him on the national vote by 3 million. One of the reasons that that's possible is because of those big states. They've swung more toward Donald Trump than other states. There are, less inefficient, wasted votes from Democrats, running up the score in states that the Democrats are already winning. But the problem for the Kamala Harris campaign is the bigger swings in the blue states have not been able to be offset in all by the swing states, and she hasn't been able to hold on to the votes where it matters.
Casey, you did touch on this a moment ago, but can you tell us the demographics that did come through for Donald Trump?
Yeah, you can see that when you look at the results. And when you look at exit polling, there are 3 real standouts: young people, Hispanic communities, and if you want to look at the figures in Florida, that's a great example of that. Donald Trump is 13 points ahead with nearly all the vote counted. He won it by 3 points, so a 10-point shift in 4 years. And then the county I'll draw your attention to is Miami-Dade, where Donald Trump has won that by nearly 12 percentage points. Let's draw a circle around that. That is the city of Miami, Miami Beach, and areas near there. Quite a big county. Remember, Donald Trump won by nearly 12 points 4 years ago. Joe Biden won it by 7. A massive swing in that community, and this is a community with a lot of Hispanic voters in it. He's also won. Trump this time has also won Osceola County, where a very high proportion of Puerto Ricans live. So that's one big trend we're seeing. And then, let's go back to New York and just show you the Bronx. This is the Bronx, young, racially diverse community. Kamala Harris, not surprisingly, is well ahead by 45 points. Joe Biden won it by 67. A very big shift in just one election toward the Republicans there. Young men, young black men especially, have seen some of the biggest swings toward Donald Trump in this election.
Casey Briggs, our elections analyst, thank you. Governments around the world have begun congratulating Donald Trump, and Anthony Albanese has now had his first conversation with the president-elect. This marks the start of a long-planned program of diplomatic outreach as the Trump transition team prepares to take office in January. Afternoon briefing host Greg Jennett joins us now from Canberra. Greg, what do we know about the Prime Minister's call and that broader plan to get off on the right foot with the new president-elect?
Gemma, great to be with you. We know that it happened after Anthony Albanese had completed a mid-morning media conference here in Canberra in Parliament House. So early evening in Washington, D.C. We also know that quite a bit of preliminary work and contact making needs to go on to make these calls possible. So we can conclude here that Australia's plans to connect with Mr. Trump are falling into place. Now, the Prime Minister's released a statement. I'll read it to you. Good to speak this morning with President Trump to personally congratulate him on his election victory. We talked about the importance of the alliance and the strength of the Australia-US relationship in security, AUKUS, trade and investment. Anthony Albanese went on, I look forward to working together in the interests of both our countries. So no revelations there, but it is worth observing that this combination, Anthony Albanese and Donald Trump, have never actually met before. So there would have been a degree of anxiety that ice get broken early. And yes, that has now happened, Gemma.
Now, the role of Ambassador Kevin Rudd and Australia's Washington Embassy, it's also receiving scrutiny after Mr Rudd's scathing assessment of Trump in 2020. What's the ambassador done now?
All right, bit of a refresher first of all. So Kevin Rudd tweeted in mid-2020 it was that Trump was, quote, the most destructive president in history. He drags America and democracy through the mud. He went on, he thrives on fomenting division. Now, at the time, Kevin Rudd was head of the Asia Society think tank, and he lived and worked in that position in New York. He took up his current post as ambassador to Washington only in March of last year. And those quotes and more that I just read out remained on what is now called his X account until last night sometime. Ambassador Rudd's now pulled them down, he says, and this is from a statement, out of respect for the office of President of the United States and following the election of President Trump. So we know they came down last night. As it happens, DFAT officials were at Senate estimates hearings here in Canberra this morning. They confirmed the removal of this material, and Shadow Foreign Minister Simon Birmingham then took up questions with Foreign Minister Penny Wong.
Kevin Rudd is doing a terrific job as Australia's ambassador to the United States, and it says a lot about how important we regard the relationship with the United States that we appointed a former Prime Minister.
Okay, so that's Anthony Albanese giving a full vote of confidence in Kevin Rudd. We might, though, go back to those exchanges I alluded to between Simon Birmingham and Penny Wong on the wisdom of the original tweets or social messaging, as we might say now, on X. This was the exchange at Senate estimates.
Kevin Rudd is doing a terrific job as Australia's ambassador to the United States, and it says a lot about how important we regard the relationship with the United States that we appointed a former Prime Minister.
And Greg, our apologies. That was a repeat there of that grab. Now, we know that you reported from Washington during Donald Trump's first term and during Joe Biden's transition to office 4 years ago. What can we expect about the president's appointment of his own US ambassador to Canberra?
Yeah, well, all ambassadors in the US system are political appointments, so they serve at the president's pleasure. Joe Biden's pick, Caroline Kennedy, she will then have to leave by January at the absolute latest. Almost certainly she'll leave well before then. Then once Donald Trump is sworn in as president on the 20th of January, he can start considering picks for roughly 4,000 appointments at home and abroad, many of them subject to confirmation by the US Senate. Now, it's instructive to consider what happened last time in 2016 when President Trump was elected. He took almost 2 years to nominate Arthur Culverhouse Jr. for the Canberra role. That then took another month for the Senate in Washington to confirm Ambassador Culverhouse. He didn't arrive in Canberra until March of 2019, and he went on to serve for, fractionally less than the 2 years remaining in Trump's first presidency. So if that's a guide, I guess we can expect more continuity at Australia's embassy in Washington than we can with the US one here in Canberra. Gemma.
Afternoon briefing host Greg Jennett, thank you. Donald Trump returns to office in a volatile global environment. The incumbent president has pledged to end 2 wars, implement tariffs and close the US border. Let's bring in International Affairs editor John Lyons now. John, how is Donald Trump's election win reverberating around the world?
Well, Gemma, I think that some countries like Australia, as we've just heard, are keen to get off to a good start with Donald Trump in his second term as president. However, there will be many countries, such as Ukraine, for example, where when I've been there for the ABC, they were extremely anxious about the idea of Donald Trump becoming president, and they are fearful that he will do a deal with Russia, essentially that allows Russia to keep the 20%, the 1/5 of Ukraine that Russia has already taken. So in some countries there'll be trepidation, in other countries they'll be keen to get off on a good start with him.
Trump has broadly called for an end to the war in Gaza. Has there been any detail as to how?
No, we don't know what he means by that. He has said during the course of the campaign that Israel should be allowed to finish the job. Nobody quite knows what that means, but he does pride himself on not starting wars and finishing wars. In fact, a claim he often makes, which is true, is that in his first term, his 4 years as president, America didn't get involved in any new major wars. And in fact, that's a contrast to, for example, the Obama presidency. So it's a bit ironical that the Democrats are seen as the peacemakers, if you like, and the Republicans are often cast as the more hardline party. But in fact, Donald Trump makes the point that he didn't start wars, and so I think he'll try to make a point of finishing the war in both Ukraine and Gaza. However he does that is still to be decided.
There are concerns with that in the case of Ukraine, if that emboldens Putin and if he were to attack a NATO member country, and the questions as to whether Trump would come to their aid. What do questions like that mean for the alliance?
Well, the central point of NATO is collective defence. That's the whole reason for its existence. That is the benefit of being a NATO member. That's why so many countries in Europe want to be part of NATO at the moment. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty says that should one member of NATO be attacked, then collectively they must all come to its defence. So if Russia attacked another member of NATO, such as Poland or Latvia or Lithuania, then the other countries would be required to come to its defence. And if Donald Trump said no to that, then essentially that's the end of the whole alliance. I don't think he'll do that. I think what he's more likely to do, he's talked about, he thinks it's unfair that the United States contributes such a lion's share of funding for NATO. And so and he's tried to pressure in his first term, as a guide to what he might do in his second term, pressured a lot of those other NATO countries to increase their contributions and increase the share of their budget that they spend on defence. Countries like Sweden, etc., are being pressured to spend 2 or 3% of their budgets on defence. And so I think that's far more likely that we'll see that from Donald Trump than him to just say, no, we don't come to the defence of another NATO country.
And finally, John, what about our region of the world? What are we looking at? What are the concerns here?
Donald Trump made clear in the campaign that he sees China as a major threat to the livelihoods of Americans, of American workers, cheap Chinese goods coming into the US. What we're likely to see, or most certainly likely to see, is that there will be tariffs imposed by the United States on China. He's talked about 60% tariffs, which is huge. China in turn would respond to that. During the first Trump presidency, Australia managed to navigate around that. Malcolm Turnbull did as Prime Minister, to keep steel and aluminium carved away from increased tariffs. So in that sense, we have a bit of an advantage that we may be able to weather any coming tariff storm.
John Lyons, our Global Affairs Editor, thank you. Let's bring in former BBC correspondent Nick Bryant now, who was part of our special coverage yesterday. What a big day it was, Nick, and thank you for coming in. Now, I mean, you've watched Trump closely for 8 years now. Tell us about the man.
Well, I met him, first of all, about 9 months before he came down that famous golden escalator. And I thought there were two Trumps on display that day. The Trump that met me outside his golden lifts, actually, who was very polite. It was almost like he regarded the BBC as an offshoot of the royal family. It was hilarious, and I was a minor royal. I'm not, by the way. And he was very lucid, he was very intelligent, he enjoyed the company of journalists, he didn't regard us as fake news at that time or enemies of the people. And then the light went on for the interview to be recorded. And Trump was far more performative, he was far more conspiratorial, he started making these extravagant boasts. It was the kind of Trump that we saw in the presidency. And And after that interview ended and he became the president, I often wonder, which Trump are we going to get? Are we going to get the kind of sensible version, or are we going to get the kind of performative, boastful, conspiratorial version? And of course, that's the version we got when he was president. And that was 8 years ago. And I think he's got a lot more conspiratorial. I think he's got a lot more aggressive. He now really despises much of the press. And I think that's the kind of presidency we'll see when he takes office again in January.
Now, we came to expect the unexpected. We know that he's transactional. What we know from that first administration and what has been promised about this second one, how do we think he will wield that power?
That's really a great question. I was with Trump when he got inaugurated. I was about 50 yards away from him on that inaugural platform, famed for those two words, American carnage. You remember it. But I was rereading his inaugural address today, and passages of it really sound like a declaration of war on Washington. He spoke of how power should be transferred from Washington to the people. But I think what he really had in mind was the transfer of power not to the American people, but to an American personage, himself. And he really wanted to wield a lot of power through the tip of his Sharpie pen by signing executive orders and bypassing Congress. And he really wanted power to be concentrated in the White House. But he was continually thwarted by the courts, sometimes by Congress, sometimes by members of his own administration who kind of just didn't do what he said he told them to do, hoping that he'd forget that he'd even told them. And what he's determined to do this time is to make sure none of those obstacles are in his way. He wants loyalists in his administration, not moderating influences or try and curb his tendencies. He wants people who are fully on board. And that's going to be the crucial difference, I think, between Trump 2.0 and Trump 1.0.
Trump's revenge comes up a bit. What do we understand that to mean? What's it going to look like?
Yeah, a revenge presidency, a retribution presidency. I mean, one of the worrying things is he has signalled very clearly that he wants to take control of the Justice Department and to use the Justice Department to pursue his perceived enemies. Now, that would demolish what has long been a firewall between the White House and the Justice Department. The Justice Department has always been kind of sacrosanct. It's something that a president doesn't interfere with and certainly doesn't weaponize in order to go after his enemies. So that's what's led to a lot of concern, and that's what's made quite a few of the people on his enemies list worried that he might use the Justice Department to come after them.
What about the idea of being a dictator for a day? What would happen there?
Well, that was something he said to Sean Hannity on Fox News. He was kind of joking, but there is this concern that he won't only look to be a kind of American dictator on day one, that he might pursue that kind of authoritarian regime throughout his presidency. I mean, his former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, has described Trump as fascist to the core. His former White House chief of staff, another military man, John Kelly, says he meets the definition of a fascist. There were definitely authoritarian tendencies on display in his first administration. Ahead of that inauguration, for instance, he said, "Make it look like North Korea. I want tanks and choppers, not marching bands and floats." And I think that is a worry, especially now. He has been emboldened by what is a significant mandate. He has not only won the Electoral College, which he did in 2016, he's done something extra. He's won the nationwide vote as well. And I think that will have an emboldening effect on Donald Trump.
Now, you mentioned his contempt for the media there. How do you make of how the US media has reacted to him and what this might mean for the next 4 years in terms of their coverage of him?
Look, covering Trump in a press conference was a little bit like confronting a monkey with a machine gun. I mean, all sorts of stuff sprang in all sorts of directions. I remember thinking when Trump became the president last time, we would have to kind of learn every lesson that we'd learned in our journalistic careers and at journalistic school and everything and apply them in this moment. And I think that is doubly true now. And it's going to be a challenging time for the media. What sort of language do we use to describe him? Do we use the word authoritarian? Do we use the word fascistic? Do we use the word fascist? I mean, these are going to be interesting questions for newsrooms all over the country. I can tell you what, if Trump was running for office in a European country, we'd be labelling him as far right. Collectively around the world, we haven't done that with Donald Trump. But there are lots of questions for the media, and there is this worry that, you know, he could come after journalists as well.
Now, if they have control, the Republicans, of the House and the Senate, what's that going to mean in terms of policy?
Well, that gives him a kind of rubber stamp in some ways. I mean, there are still safeguards. There's something called the filibuster in the Senate, which means you have to have a supermajority to get big legislation passed. Donald Trump won't have that. The Democrats will have enough votes to stop the Republicans having a supermajority. But it really helps when you've obviously got control of both houses of Congress. It really helps in getting the people you want appointed to key positions in the administration, like Secretary of State and Secretary of the Treasury. It really helps to have Congress on board. But one thing about his first administration, he initially had Congress in his hands as well. There were Republican majorities both in the House and the Senate. But what he didn't manage to do was to repeal Obamacare, which was something that he'd really set out to do, the signature achievement of the president who'd gone before him, Barack Obama. And even with a Congress, he couldn't quite get what he wanted. So it's by no means a fait accompli, you know, and often there are divisions with the Republicans. And if you look at how the Republican Party has said we're going to demolish the Green New Deal, for instance, the Inflation Reduction Act, you know, that might not be as easy as he thinks it is.
When we look at the polls and what they were telling us and what actually happened, what do we take from that?
Well, I'd suggest what we take from that is journalists are probably too heavily influenced by the polls. But the pollsters would say, well, it was within the margin of error. Yeah. And, you know, we didn't get it too wrong. We were saying this all along. It's going to be close. And, you know, the ultimate vote will end up being pretty close. And, I mean, what the election has shown is that this is a deeply, deeply polarised nation. Donald Trump has won an emphatic victory. But there are still an awful lot of Americans today who are kind of almost in mourning. They hate the idea of a second Trump administration. Yeah,
and yet when we look at the result and we look at the fact, as you pointed to before, that he's looking really good in the popular vote as well, what do the Democrats take from that?
Well, there'll be a post-mortem. Did Joe Biden stay on for too long? Should he have handed that torch over earlier? Should there have been a proper primary process so they could have selected a candidate? They had to pick Kamala Harris very quickly, when there were people like Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi saying we really need a sort of quick primary process to find out who our best candidate is. So there'll be question marks about whether she was the best candidate, whether Joe Biden stuck around too long, whether they would have been better with a candidate who wasn't part of the Biden administration, because she was trying to deliver a message of change, but at the same time she appeared on The View, that American TV show, and said she couldn't think of a way that she would differ from the Biden administration. That was a messaging problem for her. And, you know, the Democrats have got to figure out how they win back those Rust Belt states, those disillusioned white working class voters especially, who seem to be drifting towards the Republican Party.
Nick Bryan, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
This is ABC News. Our top stories: Kamala Harris has conceded defeat to Donald Trump in the US election. The Vice President urged her supporters to respect the result, but keep fighting for the ideals her campaign championed. She's phoned the President-elect to congratulate him on the victory. Leaders around the world are congratulating Donald Trump on his election victory. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has spoken directly with the President-elect and says the US-Australian relationship will continue to go from strength to strength. Mr. Trump is set to meet with President Joe Biden at the White House as part of the transition of power. The government has confirmed it's moving to ban children under 16 from using social media. The decision was made in Cabinet on Monday and will be put to a virtual National Cabinet meeting on Friday. The Prime Minister says the onus will be on social media platforms to ensure they are taking responsible steps to prevent access, not parents or children. And the Consumer Watchdog has approved a merger between pharmacy giants Chemist Warehouse and Sigma Healthcare. The $8.8 billion merger will see the company become Australia's biggest pharmaceutical retailer, with more than 1,000 stores across the country. The ACCC says the deal wouldn't substantially lessen competition in the industry. Let's get more reaction now to the US election results. Sophia A. Nelson is the founder and president of the Childless Chicks PAC, which campaigned and fundraised for Harris. And yes, the PAC's name was inspired by J.D. Vance's Childless Cat Ladies comment. Sophia A. Nelson joins us now from Virginia. Sophia, you were at Howard University, optimistic for a Harris victory. How have you processed this result that more Americans wanted Trump to be their leader?
I think that shock is a good way to put it. But, you know, if we're honest and you look at the polling data in the past week, every poll had them in a dead heat or within 1 to 4 points. And if you look at the spread in the battleground states, it just broke Trump's way. I think everybody hoped and believed, based on the energy, the massive crowds, the fundraising, the enthusiasm, that it was for Harris, but it ended up being for Trump. So I think people are going to be processing that for a while, but I think it's sunk in pretty good after the vice president conceded this afternoon.
And Kamala Harris said in that speech that her heart is full and that, quote, "I'm so proud of the race we ran." Why wasn't it enough, do you think?
I think that you have to look at the crosstabs on the data, and I think it tells a fascinating story. One, I think the economy was the #1 issue for a lot of working and middle-class Americans. And I don't think the vice president talked about the economy enough because it was a very difficult spot for her to be in, being the sitting vice president in the Biden-Harris administration on the one hand, and in trying to be the change candidate on the other hand, and not wanting to offend her boss, President Biden, and say bad things about what the truth is that we have the best economy in the world. It's better than Australia, it's better than the UK, it's better than any country on earth. We are the envy of the world. And yet, for working people who don't have investments in the stock market, who can't afford, big homes and things like that with higher interest rates, those people felt it at the gas tank and at the grocery store. And I don't think they felt heard in this election. And I think every data point I saw pointed to the economy and inflation being the really big issue here. And Harris ran on a very pro-democracy, Trump is not good for democracy, which he isn't. But that didn't resonate. And then there's also good old-fashioned racism and sexism that absolutely played a part in this as well.
And Sophia, abortion was a huge issue. What does a Trump presidency mean for reproductive rights on the federal level? And really, what would have Kamala Harris been able to do on this front?
Well, I don't think he'll be able to enact a federal abortion ban because he won't have the votes in the Senate. You need 60, to get anything done that would be like your supermajority. He's not going to have it. He's going to have 54 votes, maybe 55, depending on how one of the other Senate races goes. Is still outstanding. But I think that it's already back at the states. You've seen the bans. You've seen the effects in places like Texas and Georgia where they're extreme. I think more women will die of things not even related to pregnancy. They'll have things like fibroids or ovarian cysts, etc., that cause you to bleed, and they won't be able to get the care that they need. So I think that Trump is dangerous to women's health beyond just the abortion issue, which I think the way it was framed around abortion really misses the mark about talking about women's reproductive health and their, again, if you're a young woman and you get an ovarian cyst and you bleed out and it damages one or both of your ovaries, you won't be able to have children. So these are the conversations I think we needed to be having more than just whether or not abortion was legal at the federal level anymore.
And there's always been a gender gap in US elections. It was more pronounced, though, in 2024. Why was that? Is the abortion issue the reason for that?
No, it was Trump ran a hyper-masculine campaign targeting males. Latino males did a 30-point swing from Joe Biden in 2020 to Donald Trump in 2024. African-American males stayed kind of static. White males voted strongly for Trump. There was this real effort where she was going after the women's vote. White women voted 52% for Donald Trump. Hillary got, 1 point less at 53% of white women voting against her. So Harris only moved the needle 1 point. So the gender gap didn't work the way I think the Democrats thought it would. They thought that women would really be galvanized and outraged about Dobbs and the post-Roe, and it just didn't show up that way.
You say you've never seen such disrespect for women coming from one of the major parties as you have from the 2024 Trump-Vance ticket. How do you think women will fare under this administration's policy decisions?
I think you will not see a lot of women in the Trump administration. Or just a few in the cabinet. Trump is an old-fashioned, his theme song is James Brown's It's a Man's World. That tells you everything you know. He's a 78-year-old old dude. He's my dad's age. They see the world very differently. They see women very differently. And Donald Trump is a misogynist. He is. He talked about the vice president in ways that were just inappropriate. You couldn't say that as a CEO. You couldn't say that as a college president. You couldn't do that anywhere as a man in this world and talk about women and call them dumb and stupid and low IQ or worse, assume or insinuate that they got their way to where they were because of sexual favors. The things that he said, simulating oral sex on a microphone, as you all saw. It's just unbelievable to me that he got elected again, but he did, and he got elected pretty overwhelmingly.
Sophia A. Nelson, founder and president of the Childless Chicks PAC, coming to us there from Virginia. Thank you.
Thank you.
The US state of Michigan has been declared for Donald Trump this morning. Correspondent Elias Klur reports from Detroit.
Donald Trump famously won Michigan by under 11,000 votes in 2016, but he lost it in 2020 to Joe Biden. In 2024, him and the Republican operation saw an opportunity to win back Michigan, and they've taken it. They did it by broadening their coalition. In 2016, Donald Trump effectively cut through with blue-collar working-class voters. There's a large working-class population here in Detroit associated with the auto industry, but this time they spent millions targeting younger voters. We've seen exit polling that shows that they did particularly well with younger men here in the state of Michigan. Critically, they also performed very well with Muslim Americans and Arab Americans here in Michigan. It makes up about 3% of the population in the state, which might not seem like a lot, but when we're talking about these fine margins of winning Michigan, it could make all the difference. From the outset of the campaign, Donald Trump used the disquiet in the community over the handling of the Gaza conflict, homed in on that community. It seems to have paid off as a number of prominent Arab American community leaders endorsed Donald Trump or either told community members not to vote at all. And if we look at the areas in which the Arab American community is concentrated here in Detroit, Kamala Harris is way behind where Joe Biden was back in 2020. We spoke to the RNC Michigan chairman yesterday about how Donald Trump and why Donald Trump is so popular in the state of Michigan.
I mean, he's demonstrated to people that he cares and that he has solutions that will work for them. You know, so a lot of these people feel like they've been forgotten.
It seems extraordinary that in an area politically synonymous with blue-collar workers, Donald Trump, a billionaire from Manhattan, continues to cut through with Michigan's working class. But then again, Donald Trump continues to baffle and surprise political pundits.
Both Republicans and Democrats spent the final few weeks of campaigning aggressively pursuing Latino voters, and it appears they played a big role in Donald Trump's return to the White House. Hilario De Leon is the chairman of the Republican Party of Milwaukee County and joins us now. Hilario, this was an emphatic win for Donald Trump. He was able to flip the blue wall states. What was key here, do you think?
Well, the road to the White House, Gemma, ran directly through Milwaukee County, and it was very important that the president continued, along with the campaign, to reach out to these battleground states and reaching out to these demographics. And it was the focus on policies over personality, the fact that the economy was affecting voters in a very negative way, the issue of immigration and the issue of the world stage, the stability of the world right now and the fear of a potential World War III is what really drove voters out to the polls and really push him over the finish line to receive Wisconsin's 10 electoral votes, but also receive the popular vote and be reelected as the soon-to-be 47th president of the United States.
The details on the policy, though, were pretty light on, though, weren't they? I mean, you don't think that the strongman persona of Donald Trump won out?
Well, I think the fact that strength in leadership was very important, and what they were looking at right now, this election was a referendum on the current administration, on the fact on how weak their leadership was. And so young men, especially young Hispanic men who were struggling with in-between jobs or having to work more than 2 jobs just to put food on the table, saw a strong man who would fight for them, that pushed for policies such as no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, you name it. These were policies that people were seeking for years under this current administration, and they did not get that. And so they were excited to turn out. I think everyone was itching for this election to be done. That's why we saw so many people turn out in early voting, and we saw the numbers come out of Milwaukee County. President Trump increased his voter percentage within the African-American communities, the Hispanic communities, the Muslim communities, you name it, all the communities. He has increased his voter percentage, not just in the state of Wisconsin, but across the entire nation.
And do you think those communities were underestimated by the Democrats?
Oh, 100%. They felt like they were being left behind by the Democrat Party. This Democrat Party today is not the Democrat Party of JFK. That's why we see people like RFK Jr. switch over and join this movement. And now we'll probably be working in this in this next administration under President Trump. People were frustrated. Like I said, this was a referendum, not just on the administration, but also all the Democrat policies that were being pushed for the last 4 years were not helping voters. Again, they were struggling out here. And so they saw a fighter in President Trump. They saw that he has survived 2 assassination attempts, and he did not stop. He doesn't need this job, and he's going to be there every single day to fight for them and put their needs first.
Trump was voted out 4 years ago. Hilario, I know you were out and about speaking to people during the campaign. What did they say? What changed for them in this time?
I think, again, it's policies. It's policy over personality. People thought that the personality of President Trump did not matter at this point in time, because if it meant that he sent out mean tweets and their gas prices were low and their grocery prices were low and there was no new wars under his administration, they would rather have those mean tweets than rather having to deal with the cost of inflation rising, the issue of crime continuously rising, and the fear that we might end up in possibly a nuclear war. Now President Trump has the ability to get those things straightened out and return to the policies of 4 years ago, where life was better for most Americans.
Immigration was a big issue at this election. Do you have questions or concerns as to how this mass deportation will take place?
I have no questions, because we've already seen under President Trump's administration how he handled the issue of deportation. We went after the sex traffickers. We went after gangs such as MS-13 and Tren de Aragua, which we will continue to go after for the criminal migrants that are bringing all this crime. They're raping citizens. They're bringing in drugs such as fentanyl. There are citizens who are helping those people. All those people need to be held accountable. Those are the people that President Trump wants to go after, and people within the Hispanic community and the African-American community, or people who have come here legally. They want to see mass deportations. They don't want to see these people breaking our laws and harming our families and our citizens.
Many people said they didn't agree with all of what Trump said, and there was not enough evidence behind a lot of what he said, but the economy was more important to them. Now, is that a concern for Republicans, of any social policies that could be implemented that voters don't want to see?
I think there was a lot of evidence behind things that President Trump talked about. The issue was mainstream media did not want to talk about it, and they're out of touch with the everyday American. When I walk these streets as a county party chairman, I see firsthand the issue of homelessness, the issue of the drug epidemic. Milwaukee is a hub for human trafficking. People don't talk about that. They don't know that, and it's very unfortunate. And so I think people look at President Trump, again, he's speaking out on issues, and yes, there's not everything out there is, we can't see everything that's going on. We can't be everywhere all at once. But there are underlining issues that aren't being addressed by current leadership. And that's why the voters turned out and voted for him overwhelmingly. That's why he reached out to people within the Muslim community that were very strong Democrat supporters that say enough is enough. Our voices aren't being heard by the Democrat Party. They're taking our vote for granted, and it's time that we make a switch. And they made a switch, and they made it big time, not only within the presidency, but also within the U.S. Senate and possibly the House.
Hilario Delian, the chairman of the Republican Party of Milwaukee County, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Now, US stocks have soared as investors assess what Donald Trump's return to the White House will mean for the economy and also the world. Big bank stocks led the way on expectations that Mr. Trump's policies will lead to stronger economic growth and less regulation. So let's bring in Chief Business Correspondent Ian Verrinder now. Ian, investors are welcoming Trump's win.
Yeah, well, Gemma, that's right. I mean, the market was up 3.6%, the Dow Jones Industrial Average at least, and so that's a huge lift on Wall Street overnight following this. There was a couple of other reasons in there, though. I mean, a lot of investors did expect this to be a much tighter race, and the prospect of a drawn-out legal battle and possibly even social unrest and perhaps even violence really unsettled markets prior to that. So that the fact that Kamala Harris actually conceded very quickly just lifted all fears, and so the volatility index dived and people really just went for stocks.
Gotcha, so it gave that certainty there. Now, we know that Donald Trump has promised tariffs on US imports of Chinese goods. What effect will that have, and what could be the knock-on effect that we feel here from that?
Well, look, everyone is pretty much in agreement that if Donald Trump does, manage to get all of his policies in place to the stated degree, 10% tariffs worldwide and possibly 60% on China, that will lift inflation in the US and possibly globally. It will result in lower growth globally and possibly higher interest rates around the world. So it's not looking particularly positive on all fronts. And interestingly, we talk about Wall Street and the market really racing ahead overnight. For the past 6 weeks, money markets, and particularly in the US, have been going in the other direction. So interest rates, the 10-year government bond rate in the US, which is the global benchmark for interest rates, it's been rising. Interest rates have been rising for 6 weeks now in anticipation that perhaps global interest rates will be forced to rise if Donald Trump wins back the White House, which he's suddenly done. Now, this is really, really unusual because the US Federal Reserve, the world's biggest central bank, is in the process of a rate cutting cycle. It's only just started. Now, it's had one cut so far, a double cut, and it's got another one coming tonight. So the fact that the money markets are pushing rates in the opposite direction to the US Federal Reserve, incredibly unusual here. So markets are expecting higher inflation and higher interest rates.
On tariffs again, and understanding that we would feel the effects on tariffs on Chinese goods, of course, but we have a free trade agreement with the US. Does that give some protection for Australian firms from any tariffs from the US?
Look, free trade agreements really aren't worth the paper they're written on. I mean, all you've got to do is look at our free trade agreement with China a couple of years ago, where they basically imposed trade restrictions on everything that we export to them, apart from iron ore, to give you a bit of an indication there. So no, I don't think that free trade agreement will protect us. It would require negotiations between our government and the US government to get some kind of concession through, which did happen in the last Trump administration. We did manage to negotiate our way through tariffs at that stage. But look, there's no doubt that if the tariffs that the US is talking about imposing on China come into force, that will affect the Chinese economy in a major way. And we are, of course, China is our biggest trading partner. It couldn't help but affect us as well.
Ian Verinder, thank you.
Thanks, Gemma.
Beirut's southern suburbs have been hit by several large airstrikes in the last few hours, including on a site adjacent to Lebanon's international airport. The Israeli military had earlier issued an evacuation notice for the area, saying that there were Hezbollah facilities, without giving more details. Beirut's airport has not been directly targeted in the war between Israel and Hezbollah, and national carrier Middle East Airlines has continued to operate commercial flights. The Australian government has confirmed it wants to ban children under the age of 16 from using social media. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese says he'll meet with state and territory leaders tomorrow to discuss the change. Political reporter Evelyn Manfield has more from Parliament House in Canberra.
The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has made it clear that the onus would be on social media companies, not young users or their parents, and that's where the penalties would apply as well to social media companies rather than parents and users. Now, the driver behind this for the Prime Minister is that he says social media can cause harm to young people and he wants to look to eliminate that. Now, some other details of the plan is that it won't be grandfathered, which does imply that if you're a young person on social media, say 13 or 14 at the moment, once this law becomes law in 12 months' time, which is the plan, then you will be banned from social media. And the Prime Minister says there won't be exemptions. So even if your parents consent to you using social media, this law won't allow it.
The onus will be on social media platforms to demonstrate they are taking reasonable steps to prevent access. The onus won't be on parents or young people. There will be no penalties for users. The e-Safety Commissioner will provide oversight and enforcement.
Now, the government has also been looking to trial some age assurance technology. So it's put $6.5 million towards that. It's put out a tender, and we are expecting to find out in coming days which company will run that trial and exactly how it will work. And the federal government says that will be used to sort of inform how this age restriction can be implemented to stop young people using social media. Now, another driver behind this is there's certainly been a big media campaign across newspapers and radio, as I said, because people have warned about the harms of social media. But it'll be interesting to see how kids react to this news today, because we have also heard from some experts in this space that have previously said they didn't think the ban was the way to go, and instead it was better to inform young people on sort of how to best navigate with the world online. So what will happen now is the Prime Minister will take this plan to National Cabinet tomorrow. He'll meet online with state and territory leaders and look to get some sort of uniformity across the country. Then later this month, the Prime Minister and the Communications Minister will look to introduce this legislation to Parliament. The plan is to make it law for 12 months' time. That's when it would be enforced, the PM says. And we have heard previously from the coalition here in Canberra that it does want to see that age limit in place as well. It had been saying if a Dutton government is elected at the next election, it would enforce an age limit as a priority as well.
Australia's competition regulator has approved the merger between Chemist Warehouse and Sigma Healthcare, creating an $8.8 billion pharmaceutical giant. Reporter Nasim Hadem has the details from Melbourne.
This is a major deal in Australia's pharmacy industry, this $8.8 billion merger between Chemist Warehouse and Sigma is going to result in them having 1,000 stores across the country, as well as 16 distribution centres in Australia and New Zealand. Now, Sigma operates a lot of brands that we would know. Amcal Chemist is one of those brands, Discount Drug Stores, a number of other brands. And the agreement is that they'll be able to continue operating under those brands, but under the same one company now. Now, in June, the ACCC had expressed concerns about this merger. It had said that this is a major structural change to the pharmacy sector in Australia, and that it had fears that this could lessen competition in Australia's market. But today it's come out and it said that it doesn't think that that will happen. It slapped a number of restrictions on this merger. So one of those restrictions is that if a company does want to, or if a franchisee wants to switch, they would be able to do that. If a franchisee does decide to switch, their data won't be held by the company anymore. Obviously, a lot of these pharmacies are family-run businesses and their data is important to them. And it's also important to remember that Sigma is actually a distributor of pharmaceutical products, so it also has put restrictions on to make sure that Sigma doesn't do wrong by the franchisees in terms of being able to lock them out from getting better deals on supplies of pharmaceutical products.
Let's have a quick look at the national weather now. It's a mostly sunny day for Brisbane. The showers developing in Sydney. There's also a shower or two in Canberra. Showers developing in Melbourne. It's mostly sunny in Hobart though. The showers clearing for Adelaide. A sunny day in Perth, 22 the top there. And partly cloudy in Darwin with a top of 34 degrees. An emperor penguin has been seen on Western Australia's southern coast. The species is endemic to Antarctica and it's the furthest north the penguins have been spotted. Local Aaron Fowler spotted the massive bird waddling out of the water at Ocean Beach in Denmark, WA. A registered wildlife carer is now looking after it. Well, there is more on the ABC News app and on ABC iView. I'm Gemma Veness. Thank you for your company. We'll have more news in just a moment.